Yo, 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 people and patrons of the night. It is your boy, the Horror Lander. And from the Creepshow IP, the anthology horror series, which I am a big fan of, especially when it comes to the movies and some of the comics and the TV show that they had come out through Shudder, ended up coming out with the new piece of media earlier this week, which was a short story collection consisting of 13 stories, which you'll see thrown up on the screen, called Creepshow 13 Tales of Terror. Now, with the way that modern Creepshow has been going in terms of some of the new volumes that have been coming out in anthology comics, as well as some of the later seasons of the TV show, I've kind of been diminishing my hype and expectations for the IP. I haven't really been expecting many great things to come out. There's been some good stuff here and there that's been coming out, but just mild good, nothing too impressive or that really wowed me. But I'm very excited to say that as I read through this short story collection, Creepshow 13 Tales of Terror, and I finished it literally 30 minutes ago, this is an amazing short story collection. I loved it. There is a lot of fantastic anthology horror stories in this collection. Some of my favorite stories to come out of the Creepshow IP is in this book, and I'm genuinely impressed because I wasn't expecting great things, and yet it ended up being an amazing collection. So I'm going to be talking about a little bit today, this collection in this review. I'm not going to be going over every story because if I go over every story, it'll be a super long video, but I will be going over some of my favorites, some of the things that you can look forward to without me spoiling too much. And definitely gets 2 thumbs up from me. You guys should go on Amazon, go pick up this book, buy it, Creepshow 13 Tales of Terror, check it out. And I think that if you're a fan of the Creepshow IP, if you've never experienced the Creepshow IP, I think this is still a really good starting point because of its quality and its variety, getting you into the idea of it before you get into the movies and other stuff. And if you're a fan of anthology horror in general, I think this is definitely a short story collection that you should check out. So without further ado, let's not bullshit anymore. Let's get straight into the review. So to go into the collection, some of my favorite stories up front I'm going to talk about. Now, my very favorite story in this whole collection is one by Nancy A. Collins called The Companion Piece. Now, I've read one short story by Nancy A. Collins before that I think tied into her Sonia Blue vampire series, might have been a prototype to that. But this one was said to be inspired by Joe R. Lansdale's kids' horror story, which I'm a huge fan of, called The Companion. And The Companion actually ended up getting adapted into season 1 of the Shudder TV Creepshow. Creepshow TV show. There you go, words. And it ended up being, I think, a good episode adaptation, but I like the short story more. I think the short story is straight up fantastic. Probably one of my favorite kids' horror stories out there. Really unique and really fun. And Joe R. Lansdale is one of my favorite horror authors. I love all of his Western stuff and more pulpy fiction kind of writing. And here, Nancy A. Collins not only just managed to make something inspired off of The Companion, but by the end of the story, it actually also ties into The Companion, actually leads up to it. So this story is a wild Western story and very much feels like something you would see from the Sinners universe. For those of you familiar with that amazing, very popular horror movie that came out in recent years, Sinners with Michael B. Jordan, feels along lines in that with how the characters interact, the setting and stuff. You have this farmer family, and this black farmer has this housewife of his and this young daughter, and you end up seeing their lifestyle, how they're taking care of the farm, slice of life kind of stuff. And when they end up going into town, he ends up taking in his daughter, and you end up getting introduced to some of the more quirky characters and stuff around town. But very quickly, he ends up having to get a grocery item from the other side of town and ends up getting into one of the white store owners, who is a very powerful man in this town. He also has ties to the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, and obviously ends up threatening the farmer and ends up threatening his daughter with some goons who end up saying some very disgusting and harmful comments to her, basically threatening the farmer and his family unintentionally because he wants to buy land off him, right? He wants to buy his land and his farm and acquire that property. He offers money, but the farmer main character, the protagonist, does not want to give it up because it's been in his family for generations. The great grandparents and grandpa were, freed slave men and slave women, so they were able to acquire this property. It's a big thing. It's been taking care of their family for generations, and yet the guy is very persistent. He ends up using threatening tactics, maybe threatening to kill the family, do some horrible things to him, lynching, looting and burning down the farm and a bunch of different things which threatens not only their safety but also threatens the main protagonist's sanity. And what ends up happening is that even though his wife forbids it, but his temperament is getting the best of him, he ends up going back to his old ways, which is because his family originated from Louisiana and they were masters of voodoo. That's right, hoodoo voodoo. His grandma ended up teaching him the old ways on how to use voodoo, and he ends up going back to the old ways, using some tactics and some strategies, and ends up summoning a demon from hell using his voodoo magic and stuff. And out comes that demon, and things get chaotic after that point because then it's too far, too gone. And it's a very fleshed out story. After the whole amazing climax and all these things happen, some very heroic deeds by certain characters. You get fleshed out kind of backstory, seeing some, well, I guess epilogue, kind of seeing some things that happen to certain characters, what happens to them in the future, where they get to, and by the end it all wraps up beautifully because something happens that ties into the future story, The Companion by Joe R. Lansdale, and kind of hinting the origin of a certain object and a certain villain slash monster, if you catch my drift. So yeah, this is a 10 out of 10 perfect story. Again, felt like something straight out of the Sinners universe. I loved it. I loved the story way more than Nancy A. Collins' other vampire story, which I thought that one was a light good, but this one is flat out my favorite story in the whole Creepshow IP, and definitely the standout one in the collection that all of you should especially look out for if you end up buying this short story collection. My second favorite story in this whole collection was called Longings from a Dusty Shelf. And this story felt like a hybrid of The Crate and Father's Day from the very first Creepshow movie that came out in the early 1980s. This one's basically about this guy that you follow who is in a relationship with his wife where he cannot stand her. He thinks that she's very pretentious and pious and just very controlling, overbearing, always looking over his shoulder and kind of keeping him in the clutches of her hands. And you end up finding out that he ended up getting into an accident because him and his workers were basically working on this very luxurious hotel, and there ended up being a construction accident where he ended up falling down some pilings, fell 3 stories down, and ended up crashing and injuring his leg. So he now has a limp. And because of that, ever since that happened, he ended up meeting his future wife a few months later, falling in love first sight, and they ended up getting courted together. And she comes from a wealthy background, right? She comes from old money, riches, and all these things. And her father is this very esteemed archaeologist at this university nearby their mansion, and who ended up going on, adventures to Egypt and going into secret tombs. And she was very much introduced to that Scooby-Doo, Indiana Jones kind of lifestyle from the beginning. And what ends up happening is that as he keeps dealing with the overbearing nature of his wife, always taking care of him, even threatening him with pain and all these other things in his life, and being very nasty and mean towards others as that typical sort of old money, rich nature, he ends up one day when basically her and her father are interacting, he ends up taking a stroll to kind of walk off his pain in the university campus, and he hears a raspy telepathic voice start calling him and leading him down this lower level floor of the university. And when he ends up going into this strange storage room where there's all these, shelves filled with old artifacts and old items, he ends up realizing that the telepathic voice is coming from this jar filled with this milky serum septic kind of liquid, and inside is this very deformed, like, fetus kind of creature in there that's got these deformed hands, a pig-like face, very babyish. And it ends up speaking to him with this bleached over eye, and ends up describing that it can fulfill his desires, it can fulfill his wishes, but not just any wishes, his deepest desires, which it suspects that in him is murder. It senses that contempt, it senses that anger and that frustration, and kind of lets him know that it can fulfill it almost like a jinn, like an evil genie. He ignores it, obviously. He thinks that it's crazy. He ends up going away and walking away from the situation. But then as things keep escalating in his life and problems keep getting tighter and tighter, he ends up slowly getting into the influence of this thing, maybe relying on it for something. And then you get this huge recontextualization and twist by the end that made it a super fun story and a really fucked up fate for a certain character. So yeah, this one feels like The Crate mixed with Father's Day. Father's Day because of that old money, rich kind of family ties sort of stuff that you get throughout the story, that pretentious feel. And at the same time, you have the crate, the idea of this loaded weapon, particularly trying to murder the wife and revenge and all these kind of things in there. So they both kind of merge together. And yet at the same time, it's unique. The whole recontextualizing ending, the villain is its own unique thing. So I think it offers enough different stuff to it. So overall, I give it a 9.4 out of 10. Great. It is definitely in my top 5 favorite stories from the Creepshow IP. So the fact that you got basically 2 stories in the short story collection, which ended up being in my top 5, says a lot. So off to an amazing start. My third favorite story in this collection was called 5 is the Best Number. This is a really weird haunted house revenge tale where you follow this family reunion in this backwoods, decrepit kind of house, and you realize that this family consists of 4 siblings. You have 3 brothers and 1 daughter, and they basically have this backstory that in this small kind of backwoods rural town, townsfolk hate them because when they were growing up as kids, the mother and father basically treated the kids like the spawn of Satan. You know, they were hoping that each time they gave birth to a new child, one of them would end up being a glimmer of hope. But no, they all ended up being basically menaces to society, just really evil kids, the type who would chase cats with, kitchen knives and, burn ants with magnifying glasses, beat up on kids, rob stuff and cause trouble. And all throughout life, they've been plagued by their, background, by their past, by their childhood. They've been failures in life, but now they're all getting together for this big family reunion since the mother, the matriarch of the family, has passed away, and now they've inherited this house. But this house has some bad history because what they don't, mention until later, you find out in some harsh, kind of dark truths, is that they had a fifth sibling, right? There was a fifth child, and the fifth child was the youngest, and it was a girl who ended up being completely the opposite of the 4 other kids. She ended up being a glimmer of hope. She was very bright, she was very smart, very intelligent, very kind, very generous, and the siblings ended up getting very jealous of her. The daughter, the other older daughter, she didn't actively harass, this girl, but she was kind of like an open witness, just kind of let it happen. And eventually things went bad. And let's just say some murderous schemes were taken out, some bloodbaths were shed, very, very dark, dark things. And now that they're in this family reunion house, just kind of figuring out what to do with it, they start getting haunted by the past, and some bad things start happening. They get some creepy atmosphere and creepy feeling involving this house. It might be haunted by something. And there's a sort of revenge tale that plays out with different showdown kind of things and nostalgic ways that certain people get fucked up and killed. So, I don't want to spoil it, but that's you can kind of piece together what I'm kind of hinting towards. So yeah, this was a very weird and unique haunted house story, a revenge tale, but I like the showdown aspect. I like the kind of personal, nostalgic aspect that it brings into the story, recollecting things and pieces of the past, like missing pieces to a puzzle and then putting it together, making it relevant again, right? Very unique threat. I like the way that the threat deals with the characters and some of the messages about, family ties and, being a witness to things and, how your past can haunt you. And this story has like multiple layers as to the past haunting you that kind of all tie together by the end. And I really enjoyed it, man. The layers to the story and, the way that it plays out made it very unique and very fun. So I definitely enjoyed that one a lot. And the last story that makes my Mount Rushmore, I guess you can say, of this book is one called The Predator's Heart. And this one felt like straight up something you would see in Horrors of War by Tim Curran. Tim Curran's my favorite horror author, creature feature master. He has a short story collection, which is one of my favorites of his, called Horrors of War, dealing with monsters and occult things and different historical war settings and supernatural stuff. And this has that. The Predator's Heart opens up with you following the Nazis in a assault submarine down underneath the ocean, and they end up sinking this cargo oil ship of British carriers who end up getting destroyed by their torpedoes. And after that, you investigate some of the crew. You get introduced to some of that Nazi nationalism, some of the radicalism, and, the sins of war and all this different, ideas of murder and who's our enemy and are we our own enemy? What's our mentalities? There is a guy on the crew who I think his name is Stolt, and he's like the second in command. And he basically, talking with the captain, struggles with seeing other people under this very radical point of view as to like just killing anybody who's not a Nazi, that the Nazis are the best and all these things. He just doesn't understand it, because when you kill these other soldiers and other men from, other countries, other nations, other flags, they of course have families and they have lives, and they're just people following what they're supposed to do the same way we are. But the captain kind of explains to him their mentality, that this is the art of war, right? Shout out to Sun Tzu. This is the art of war. They are the prey. We are the predators, right? You have to have a predator's heart, and that's what makes you a real leader in the military, in whichever faction you're fighting for. And you get introduced to analogies with the wolf and the sheep, and that the world is our sheep and we get to take what we want. And after this kind of back and forth and getting introduced to these characters, you end up having the situation where there's an unidentified creature or object which ends up slamming into their submarine. And after a brief scare that they kind of brush off as just a strange phenomenon, soon at night, or very quickly, they end up having some strange things happen, which is that some of the, boatmen who are inside of this submarine end up getting attacked by a parasitic, like, seaweed algae green type of sentient vines that start sneaking their way and telepathically communicating to them to open up the hatches and do all these things to let itself in. And the moment that one of their victims ends up doing it, these parasitic green algae seaweed vines end up coming out and smashing through his ear and coming out the other and wrapping around his head, and end up making all these different soldiers into mind control puppets, doing like a hive mind kind of parasitic infestation, and ends up taking over this crew one by one. And the captain and lieutenant are in charge of dealing with it, but it's very difficult to deal with, and now it ends up into a kind of hopeless situation. So yeah, felt very much like something you would see in Tim Curran's Horrors of War unofficially. Definitely something he would write. A really freaky but really cool story. I like the villain, I like the threat. I like the reversal, the role switch on the predator's heart, the prey and the predators. These guys who think they're on top of the world, who think that they're the predators, and the other soldiers and other factions and countries are prey, they end up becoming prey to a much greater threat. I like all of that stuff. And even though it's a bit short, it's very gory, very violent, and very disturbing. So very commendable. And there's a couple other short stories in this collection that are also really good. There's one that's called When the Mask Falls, which opens up with an actor at the Oscars, and you find out that this guy was a talentless hack who immediately became this superstar kind of actor in the industry. And you find out that it's because his uncle was also a talentless hack, but ended up at a fate encounter with the gypsy, getting this item belonging to a Greek god, a mask, which allows him to basically shapeshift, but not physically, but allow to take on different personas and make him into a successful actor. And that cursed object ends up being rewarding, but also taking away some things, causing some problems and some very disturbing body horror that happens, that is very enjoyable. So that one was pretty fun. It was a very good story. You also have one called The Hide, which is like another Horrors of War kind of thing, where these guys are hunting, they're mercenaries, and they're out looking for victims, and the ghosts of their past come after them, and it's not just ethereal ghosts, it's much more horrific things that are coming after them. Kind of like something to tide you over from the first Creepshow movie, but I think in this case done better. And you also had one that was really strange with a really weird title, but it's called If You're Flapping and You Know It. Yeah, play on If You're Sexy and You Know It. It's just called If You're Flapping and You Know It. And it's about a guy who's in this house to himself after a recent divorce or separation with his partner. And he has a bat infestation in his house that he has to deal with. And the exterminator says that the bats in the attic that are hoarding up there are a protected species, so he can't necessarily go in and just kill them. And it'll be some, protective federation and, regulated laws as to what they can do and, see what they could do about it. But the guy who owns the house ends up getting frustrated, ends up taking matters in his own hands, getting protective gear, hazmat suits, poison traps, and an aluminum bat, and goes up there to kill the bats with this bat and other things himself, be a makeshift exterminator, terminator. And it ends up going bad when he ends up getting bit by one of the bats by an accident that he does. And when he's afraid that he got rabies, but the doctor reassures him that he's okay, he starts hallucinating. Some weird things start happening to him. And he may end up actually having a lot worse things happen to him than just hallucinations. So this was a really weird story, but it reminded me of the Haunting Hour episode called The Cast. The Cast is a really fun but dark episode from the Haunting Hour, and this reminded me of that with some of the things involving the hallucinating and the creature bite and some other stuff. But by the end, it ended up being a really disturbing twist reveal, punchline twist reveal that I kind of suspected when it was leading up to that point. But yeah, I really enjoyed that. So it was a weird one. Some of the things didn't make much sense in terms of certain things, but you can kind of piece together some context clues. So that was still a good story. And there's, the rest of these stories are still enjoyable. There's no bad stories in this entire collection. And there's even a short story in here, which actually ties in the Creep. Yeah, that's right, the Creep, the mascot of Creepshow, actually ties into a story similar to Lower Birth from Tales from the Crypt, where that story ended up being an origin story for the Crypt Keeper. Here it's a story involving the Creep and canonizing him into the verse. Although it's not a good story, it's like a okay, decent story, but I think that's still a cool nod. So overall, an amazing short story collection. Again, this is probably what I would say in my top three favorite pieces of media from the Creepshow IP. You have the first movie, of the second movie, and then this is up there, right? And again, I love that Volume 1 comic as well that came out from Image Comics or whatever their name is. But I think this is still like a tier up above that. So yeah, this is an amazing short story collection. So if you guys think that the descriptions are very fun and the things I talked about appeal to you as an anthology horror comic fan, just an anthology horror story fan, if you love the Creepshow IP, if you're interested in trying out the Creepshow IP, but you haven't checked out the movies yet, haven't checked out the TV show yet, haven't checked out the comics, I think the short story collection is actually a really good place for you to start. And it gives you a lot of variety, it gives you a lot of fun stuff, and you will really enjoy it. And even if in general you just like horror short story collections, this is definitely one that you should go ahead and buy. Sorry if I was stuttering or all over the place, trying to keep things together, but I'm a bit under the weather and my throat's feeling not the best, but hopefully you guys got the general gist of that. And again, go on Amazon, buy the collection on Kindle or a physical copy, check it out. And I do not think you'll be disappointed. I think you will have a fun time if you're an EC Comics fan, a Creepshow fan, anthology horror comic fan, or just, horror short story collection fan in general. And that's all I got for today. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and comment down below your thoughts and opinions. Are you a fan of the Creepshow IP? What's some of your favorite stories? What are some horror short story collections you recommend to me that I haven't checked out yet? And if you've read this book or you decide to read this book, go ahead and let me know your thoughts down below as well. But that's all I got for today. Deuces.